I was watching a colleague of mine, Mark, during a high-stakes meeting last Tuesday. For years, Mark has been the pillar. When a project fails or a client screams, he's the one with a steady hand and the calm voice. He's the guy who stays until 9 p.m. because someone has to. That day, he was his usual self-stoic, nodding, absorbing everyone else's stress like a sponge. He looked bulletproof. But then, something incredibly small happened. A pen ran out of ink. Just a cheap plastic ballpoint. Mark tried to write, realized it was dead, and he just stopped. He didn't ask for another one. He didn't even swear. He just stared at that pen with a look of such profound, hollow exhaustion that the entire room briefly went silent. It wasn't frustration over the ink. It was the sudden, crushing realization of a limit he didn't know he had reached. Later that afternoon, I saw him in the parking lot. He wasn't leaving. He was just sitting in his car, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. When I asked if he was all right, he gave me this weirdly detached smile and said, "I think I've just been the strong one for about 10 years too long." He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was describing a structural failure in his own life. It made me realize that for people like Mark, strength isn't a personality trait. It's a survival strategy that has become an identity. We've all been taught to admire the person who never breaks, the one who carries the weight of the family, the office, or the relationship without a word of complaint. But we rarely talk about the silent erosion of the pillar. We don't ask what happens when the person everyone leans on finally realizes there's no one standing behind them. The truth is, there is a specific kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. It's the weight of having been strong for too long, not out of pride, but because you felt you had no other choice. What happens when the strong one finally decides to stop holding up the world? That story about Mark, in the pen, it just perfectly captures that feeling of a deep structural failure. It's not about him losing his nerve or not having enough grit. It felt like watching a machine run out of spare parts. And you see it everywhere, this confusion of a survival strategy with a whole identity. It's just, it's not a sustainable model.
It isn't. And what's so dangerous is that our society, our workplaces, our families, they often reward this exact unsustainable behavior.
Right.
We look at the pillar, at the mark in our lives, and we mistake that exhaustion for excellence.
Yeah, for commitment.
Exactly. So the goal of this deep dive is to sort of step back from that purely personal story of failure. We want to analyze the enormous systemic pressures that create the strong one role to begin with.
Okay, so where do we start?
We're going to look at the silent erosion through three really distinct lenses. First, there's the evolutionary mismatch, basically how our ancient biology is failing in our isolated modern lives.
Ancient hardware, modern software.
Precisely. Then we'll get into the behavioral economics of it all, how strength gets treated like a social resource, and the huge cost of the free rider problem.
And what's the third lens?
And finally, the psychological identity trap, how the burden of perfectionism ultimately builds a cage around the individual.
We have to start right there at the beginning, at the biological roots. It really does feel like this friction is what's creating that exhaustion we saw in Mark. And, we heard about this other story about a man named Jinho in Seoul. He was the ultimate key pillar, the lone provider, living this ancestral code of solitary strength. Until his nervous system just locked up in a convenience store. He was running a program that his hardware just couldn't support anymore.
And Jinho's story is a perfect, almost clinical illustration of this evolutionary mismatch of the lone provider. His body literally resigned from a job that it was never, ever designed to do alone.
So to understand why that happens, we have to go back, way back.
We have to. We need to look at our ancestral blueprint for support, specifically a concept that anthropologists call the cooperative breeding model.
Cooperative breeding, that feels so counterintuitive to everything we're taught today about rugged individualism and being self-sufficient.
It's completely at odds with it. And that's the core of the problem. Humans evolved as cooperative breeders. And believe it or not, that's a surprisingly rare system among primates.
Really? I would have thought it's more common.
Not at this level. Our survival required extensive allomaternal assistance.
Allomaternal, what does that mean exactly?
It's just a term for help from group members who aren't the genetic parents. So think grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, uncles, basically the whole tribe acting as allo parents.
So this wasn't just a nice to have social structure. It was required for our species to even survive.
It was absolutely essential. I mean, consider the sheer energy cost. Scientists estimate that raising one single human child to the point where they can feed themselves requires something like 13 million calories.
Wow. 13 million.
It's a staggering number. Now, if a mother had to bear that entire energetic cost all by herself, she would have to. Well, she'd have to dramatically lengthen the time between births just to survive.
So the whole group's reproductive success depended on sharing the load.
Exactly. This cooperative system allowed early hominid females to have these very costly, big-brained offspring without sacrificing reproductive rates. The alloparents, the helpers, they buffered the most vulnerable from starvation. It's a huge reason why early Homo erectus was so successful in spreading out of Africa. Our very survival as a species was built on shared labor.
Okay, so if the survival of the baby depended that intensely on help from the group, it must follow that the mother's own commitment would become conditional on whether she thought she'd get that help.
That's a powerful insight, and it's spot on. It made maternal commitment conditional, which really sets us apart from most other apes. Well, you can see it in ethnographic and historical records. If a human mother felt she didn't have enough allomaternal support, if she looked around and perceived that the tribe wasn't going to step up, she was significantly more likely to abandon the infant at birth.
That's grim. But it makes a kind of brutal biological sense.
It does, and it created these massive selection pressures. Since the mother's commitment depended on getting help, the infants themselves had to evolve to actively get that help.
So our babies basically became expert social manipulators out of pure necessity.
In the best sense of the word, yes. They had to engage not just their mothers, but a whole network of caretakers. It's why human infants seek out faces, why they use the whites of their eyes to direct our gaze, which is unique among primates, and why they smile and babble in ways that just pull you in and elicit care from multiple adults.
So our brains are literally wired for connection and help-seeking from birth.
Deeply wired, even the complex neural wiring that supports helpful cooperative motivations. It evolved in these tight-knit cooperative groups. It reinforces what's called inclusive fitness, the biological benefit of helping people who share your genes.
Which brings us right back to Jinho in that convenience store in Seoul. We're running this ancient brain, a brain engineered for a system of distributed emotional and, caloric labor, but we're living in a social structure that demands the absolute impossible from one person. That's the modern collapse of the tribe right there.
That is the evolutionary mismatch in full flight. We are biologically, cognitively, emotionally. We are basically the same as our hunter-gatherer ancestors who lived and died by the group. Our minds were designed for the prehistoric savanna, but we're forcing them to navigate these modern urban landscapes of concrete and screens and just ceaseless artificial stimulation.
And the friction points become so obvious when you frame it like that. The speed of life, the endless notifications, the real lack of genuine physical connection. We're just perpetually overstimulated.
Which keeps our stress response system, the cortisol pump on chronic high alert. Our bodies are designed for a short burst stress response. You see a predator, you run, and then you rest.
But today, the predator is the email inbox that never goes away.
It never goes away. And we try to replace that ancient close contact support with digital connectivity. And that's another area where the mismatch becomes really acute.
What do you mean?
Think about activities that involve physical proximity. Communal meals, working together, group hunting. These all stimulate the release of oxytocin.
The bonding hormone.
Exactly. It's a really potent neuropeptide that's crucial for reducing stress, for building trust, for bonding. Oxytocin is basically the biological currency of the village.
And a Zoom call doesn't quite cut it.
It doesn't. Yeah. Modern digital interactions, texting, video calls, social media, even though they offer huge connectivity, they often fail to adequately trigger those deep biochemical pathways. You can have 5,000 friends online, but your brain can still be registering acute isolation because it's not getting the right neurochemical signals that the tribe is truly there and trustworthy.
It's the difference between reading a description of a hug and actually getting one. Your brain knows what it is, but your body isn't getting the hormonal payoff.
Precisely. So when that support system is stripped away and one person is expected to carry that entire weight, the metaphorical weight of 13 million calories burnout isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable biological outcome.
You can see this in the data on mental health, can't you? The comparison between traditional societies and industrialized ones is just staggering.
It's night and day. Clinical depression is exceptionally rare among traditional hunter-gatherer groups. Some studies, like those on the Kaluli people in Papua New Guinea, estimate the prevalence at maybe 1 in 2,000 individuals.
1 in 2,000. And in industrialized nations.
In most industrialized nations, the prevalence of major depressive disorder is over 5%.
That's a massive difference.
It's a chasm. And it strongly suggests that so much of our anxiety, loneliness, and mood disorders are direct consequences of this evolutionary mismatch, compounded by our modern isolation. the very neural mechanism we evolved to monitor our group and get help, a vital survival function. It gets twisted in today's competitive, unsupported environment. It just manifests as hypervigilance and social anxiety. The pillar is constantly scanning for the help that never comes.
And that constant scanning, that hypervigilance, it leads us straight into the next big problem. Because if the strong person is doing the work of the entire tribe, then the rest of society will naturally start to treat that person as a resource.
An infinitely renewable resource.
Exactly. Not as a human being who needs care in return. And this is where we get into the economics of exhaustion. The story of Sarah, the project manager in London, is a perfect case study for this economic trap. She became a social utility.
A utility. That's a great way to put it.
Her colleagues, her family, her friends, they all just offloaded their emotional stress onto her because she was the one who could handle it. She ended up the victim of a massive free rider problem.
Everyone was benefiting from her strength, but no one was putting anything back into her maintenance fund.
Exactly. And when she finally burned out, the reaction from everyone wasn't just sympathy. In many cases, it was inconvenience. They'd lost their utility.
And that is the absolute core of the issue. The strong one's stability becomes an unpriced external benefit for everyone else in the system. And the best way to analyze this is through the lens of emotional labor.
Now, people use that term a lot, sometimes pretty loosely. What's the specific sociological meaning?
So the sociologist Arlie Hochschild defined it very precisely. It's the act of managing your own emotions and the emotions of others, specifically to meet job or relationship expectations.
Okay, so the key is that it's required by an outside force, like an employer, to get a certain result.
Exactly. It's about producing a specific emotional state in someone else. Calmness, trust, happiness. And the employer often controls how you do it through training or scripts. Think about healthcare workers, flight attendants, customer service reps.
So it's not just about having feelings at work, it's about regulating them as part of a transaction.
That's the perfect way to put it. Sarah was performing this all day, every day at work, but then she went home and carried a second parallel burden.
The emotion work, that's the distinction, right?
It is. Emotion work is the same kind of labor, but it happens in the private sphere.
Why?
With family and friends. It's that unpaid, often invisible labor of managing household harmony, of being the informal therapist for a friend in crisis, or always being the one to de-escalate a family argument.
And this work tends to fall disproportionately on certain people.
Overwhelmingly so. It often falls on women, perpetuating this silent burden of relational management. Sarah's internal bank account was being drained by both forms of labor, paid and unpaid.
And the high achievers, the people we call the strong ones, they often engage in the most damaging forms of this. They're constantly trying to bridge that gap between how they actually feel and how they're supposed to look. This is where that difference between surface acting and deep acting becomes so important.
It's absolutely critical for your health. Surface acting is when you just display the required emotion without changing how you actually feel. It's the classic service with a smile, even when you're feeling awful.
It's putting on the mask.
It's the mask. Deep acting is a much more effortful cognitive process. That's where you actively try to change your internal feelings to genuinely match the emotion you're supposed to be showing.
So if surface acting is wearing the mask, deep acting is trying to actually become the mask. It sounds like deep acting would be harder, more draining.
You would think so, but paradoxically, the research shows that surface acting is generally more harmful. It leads to much higher levels of emotional exhaustion and burnout.
Why is that?
It's the constant dissonance. That gap between what you feel and what you're forced to show is incredibly corrosive. The mental effort required to maintain that facade while actively suppressing your genuine feelings. It creates this acute stress and a huge cognitive load. Deep acting, while it's still effortful, causes less internal friction because you're bringing your internal state and your external performance closer together.
But the real kicker, the real tragedy in all this, is that this incredible effort, whether it's surface or deep, is so often completely uncompensated. Which leads to this idea of a wage penalty.
The wage penalty is where the whole behavioral economics model just falls apart. You'd think that jobs with high emotional labor demands would be rewarded with higher pay, but that's not what happens.
Oh, what does happen?
Whether you get compensated for that emotional skill depends almost entirely on the perceived cognitive demand of your job.
Okay, break that down for me. If I'm emotionally managing a really hostile client, why does my salary depend on whether my job is seen as smart?
Okay, so if you're in a job with high cognitive demands, say you're a CEO managing a huge financial crisis or a surgeon delivering a terrible diagnosis, the emotional labor you perform to maintain composure and instill confidence is compensated.
Right. It's seen as part of a high-level skill set.
Exactly. It's bundled with high-value technical skill. But if you're in an occupation that's seen as low in cognitive demands, like a retail worker, a caregiver, a frontline public servant, you actually face a wage penalty when the emotional labor demands go up.
That is just.
Yeah.
It's deeply unfair. So you're doing the same emotional heavy lifting, but you're actually paid less for it.
Yes. The underlying societal assumption is that in those roles, caring and empathy and emotional stability are just inherent natural skills, often associated with female-dominated fields, and therefore they should basically be performed for free.
So when Sarah was acting as the unofficial counselor for her entire office and her family, her stability was just treated as a baseline utility. It was invisible, uncompensated work.
And it was likely happening at the expense of her own health and her own career advancement. This feeds directly into that relational pattern you mentioned earlier, overfunctioning.
Her colleagues were free-riding on her strength, maybe not because they were malicious, but just because her performance made it so easy for them to do so.
Overfunctioning is that pattern where one person habitually takes on more than their fair share of responsibility, especially when things get stressful. It starts as a genuine act of care or competence. I can handle this better or I can do it faster, but it quickly becomes a habit of self-erasure.
And the system rewards it. The world gives the overfunctioner promotions, praise, or trust.
Externally, yes. But internally, that person is battling this acute exhaustion and often a deep resentment that comes from feeling exploited, which of course just fuels the very free rider problem that's causing the stress in the first place.
It's a closed, destructive feedback loop. The more you succeed by overfunctioning, the more the world expects it from you, and the deeper you sink into that role until the entire system just stabilizes completely around your exhaustion.
And eventually, that role, that economic burden, becomes something deeper. It becomes your identity.
When society keeps rewarding you for erasing your own needs, you eventually internalize that behavior as the only source of your value. And that's the jump from an economic burden to a full-blown psychological identity trap. We saw this so clearly with Lang, the young entrepreneur in Shenzhen. For him, the strongman persona was a demoralized survival strategy in a brutally competitive environment. He saw vulnerability as a weakness, as just high-cost emotional noise that would interfere with his signal of competence.
And Liang's choice was brutally rational, given that environment, but the cost is the loss of what we could call psychological sovereignty. Yeah. When you adopt that pillar status as your entire identity, you fundamentally change how you value yourself. It creates what psychologists call a contingency of self-worth.
Meaning, your self-worth isn't intrinsic anymore. It's conditional. It depends on outside results.
Precisely. Your value becomes completely tangled up with your achievement, your competence, your reliability. And for people who've been the strong one for too long, this is just devastating because failure stops being a momentary event or a chance to learn.
It feels like absolute proof that you're unworthy.
Right.
Or a fraud.
Exactly. That composure and reliability that everyone else admires. It's often secretly fueled not by inner peace, but by this deep, pervasive fear of disappointing people. Or even worse, the fear of no longer being needed because you're no longer useful.
And that fear is what calcifies this identity into perfectionism.
Yeah.
But we need to be clear, we're not talking about a healthy drive for excellence here.
No, this is something much more toxic. We're talking about socially prescribed perfectionism.
Socially prescribed.
It's the most dangerous variant. It's not about achieving your own personal standards. It's the belief that others, your parents, your boss, your partner, expect you to be perfect. And that if you fall short of that, you will be rejected or shamed.
So the strength the world demands of you becomes this internal taskmaster demanding the impossible.
And that fear-driven striving is one of the strongest predictors we have for anxiety, depression, and burnout.
This identity cage, this burden of perfection, it gets amplified so dramatically when it's tied to bigger cultural narratives of necessary endurance. And a powerful example of this is the strong Black woman schema.
The strong Black woman schema is a critical and incredibly powerful example of this. It's a cultural ideal that functions as an adaptive coping strategy against systemic oppression and against these deeply rooted, disparaging stereotypes, like the angry Black woman trope.
So it's a shield, a way to survive in hostile, hyper-scrutinized environments.
It is a shield. It mandates unyielding strength, intense emotional repression, self-silencing, and endurance. The priority is placed on supporting family and community, often at the direct expense of personal self-care and health.
But that shield has to be incredibly heavy to carry alone.
It's a classic double-edged sword. Externally, it can facilitate empowerment, resilience, agency. It helps individuals navigate very real systemic barriers. But internally, the internalization of the schema is a significant and measurable risk factor for negative mental health outcomes. We're talking chronic distress, depression, anxiety.
Because the internalized expectations, this idea of psychological invulnerability and perpetual endurance, it just promotes self-criticism and emotional inhibition.
Exactly. And because vulnerability is basically forbidden by the schema, the act of seeking help, especially for mental health, is often seen as a failure of the self, which just traps the individual even further.
And what about the emotional toll? You mentioned emotional inhibition.
Well, the suppression of anger is a key component. It's often intended to avoid falling into those negative stereotypes of aggression. But that suppressed anger and chronic self-silencing leads to significant psychological symptoms. It also necessitates what are called compensatory behaviors.
Like what?
Constantly modifying your behavior to appear non-threatening, which, as you can imagine, is absolutely exhausting.
And this impossible standard must make people uniquely vulnerable to imposter syndrome.
It dramatically heightens that vulnerability. Imposter syndrome, or IS, is that nagging maladaptive belief of incompetence, despite clear, objective success. The strong Black woman schema sets this unattainable standard of excellence that forces individuals to constantly prove their worth and intelligence in spaces where they may already be doubted or marginalized.
So they live in fear that their fraudulence will be exposed the moment they show any crack in the armor.
And that links the imposter syndrome directly to increased psychological distress and decreased self-esteem. It's the ultimate psychological paradox. The very strength that was designed to protect you from external threat turns inward and causes this chronic self-erasure.
This kind of immense continuous pressure has to manifest physically at some point. Where does the body send the final warning signals?
The body becomes the final warning system. But we often miss the signs because, again, they're masked as ambition or commitment. Chronic self-suppression, that relentless overriding of your own needs and emotions, it keeps the nervous system in a constant low-grade state of stress. It's what the psychologist Stephen Porges called neuroception.
Neuroception.
It's your body's unconscious, automatic assessment of whether an environment or a person is safe, dangerous, or life-threatening.
So even if you're consciously in a totally calm setting, your biology can still be screaming danger because it's been conditioned for years to scan for threats.
Exactly. The result is exhaustion that's masked as high function. This is the fatigue that sleep cannot fix because the root cause isn't physical exertion, it's neurological hypervigilance.
What does that look like? What are the symptoms?
It might be unusual irritability, finding yourself snapping over small things like Mark and his pen. It can also be a feeling of physical contraction, a body that feels tight, rigid, or defensive for no clear muscular reason. The strong one has often lost the ability to even name their needs. They default to action.
What needs to be done?
Instead of reflection, what do I need? This constant overriding of your own internal warning signs is the core mechanism of the silent erosion of the pillar.
And the final breakdown, the actual collapse. It isn't usually from some catastrophic event, is it? It's something trivial. It's the last straw. Jin-Ho freezing in the store, Mark staring at the dead pen. It's that small, almost negligible moment that finally tips the scales.
We call that the moment of bascule, the tipping point. The collapse happens over something minor because the entire system was already running at 110%. That sudden silence, that tiny failure, it acts as a catalyst for this profound, sudden awareness.
And in that moment, the pivotal question finally breaks through.
Who is carrying me? It's this agonizing realization that your body, through all those symptoms, has understood the limit for a very, very long time. Your conscious mind is just arriving late to the party to finally acknowledge the debt.
And when the mind finally does process that reality, the emotion that often comes to the surface is that forbidden anger.
It's what the French call colère, a dense, compact anger. And it's often misunderstood by people on the outside because it isn't explosive or destructive.
What is it then?
It's an anger that seeks re-equilibration. It's a statement. It says, I gave too much. I was not joined in this effort. It was not fair. Psychologically, this anger is fundamentally healthy. It marks the end of denial. It signals the return of the individual subject to themselves. It's the boundary finally reasserting itself.
But I imagine that healthy anger is often socially rejected. It threatens the comfortable status quo that was built on that person's overfunctioning.
It is very poorly tolerated. People are comfortable with the strong person. They're sometimes even comfortable with the anger of a dominant person. But the anger of the tired pillar that disrupts the established order of extraction.
Because it forces everyone else to acknowledge their own complicity in the free rider problem.
And that makes them profoundly uncomfortable, which then pushes the pillar right back into the most common hurdle, this intense internal shame about asking for help.
Why is that shame so specific and so powerful for the strong one?
The shame of asking for help is tied directly to the fear of losing their exchange value. Their entire worth has been defined by their utility, by being the one who gives. To ask for help feels like an internal betrayal, a visible failure to uphold the core identity.
So the thought is, if I ask for help, I become a burden and I lose my place in the hierarchy of competence.
Yes. And when their small, weak signals for need go unaddressed over the years, they tragically conclude that they just don't count unless they're actively giving something.
This is where we get that critical confusion between autonomy and what you call autosufficiency.
It's a major psychological error. True autonomy, genuine self-governance, gets confused with isolation and autosufficiency, this philosophical fiction of the totally independent individual.
But that's not how we're built.
Not at all. The human brain is a social organ. It's regulated and stabilized by connection. True resilience doesn't come from just pushing through pain forever. It comes from honoring your limits. That's the definition of self-compassion.
So a truly solid person knows how to lean without collapsing.
And how to ask for help without feeling like they're dissolving. That is the definition of true, sustainable strength.
So the path forward isn't about becoming weak or losing strength.
Yeah.
It's about transitioning from a rigid, isolated structure to a resilient, connected one. Where does someone even begin that process?
You start by reclaiming your psychological sovereignty. A lot like Liang did with his team, he performed a calculated act of strategic vulnerability.
Strategic vulnerability, I like that.
Admitting he was overwhelmed and refusing to be a machine wasn't an act of surrender. It was a conscious, tactical move to redefine his utility and his role. This transition means you have to cease functioning in permanent surcharge. It means deciding to stop being strong for everyone else and to start being solid for yourself.
So you have to replace that rigid stoic performance with something more like emotional agility.
Absolutely. Emotional agility is about practicing facing your feelings with curiosity, not with judgment, and then responding to them with flexibility. And the first practical step is just to identify the cues of that internalized pressure.
What do you mean by cues?
When do you feel guilty? Is it when you sit down for 5 minutes without doing anything? Why do you find yourself apologizing for needing simple support? Why do you feel that urge to immediately justify taking a break? These are all data points. They're telling you that the old role is still trying to demand payment.
And you have to actively work to dismantle the shame that's associated with seeking support.
It has to be an intentional process. You have to recognize that the shame is tied to that fear of losing your perceived utility. The huge shift is accepting that asking for help isn't a failure. It's a necessary redistribution of effort.
And you have to be smart about who you ask.
That's critical. Stop waiting for universal recognition or reciprocity. That's exhausting and it's impossible. Instead, you have to strategically choose your allies.
And these aren't the allies who just admire your performance or rely on it.
Precisely. You choose the allies who aren't there because they profit from your strength, but who are simply present. The people who don't require immediate reciprocation, who know how to just be nearby without needing you to be emotionally well for them to stick around. It's a sober adult choice to build genuine reciprocal security and move away from that transactional strength.
So if there are pillars listening to this right now, what are some of the small, practical acts of sovereignty they can try this week to start shifting away from that chronic overfunctioning?
The smallest acts are often the most powerful because they break the old pattern. Try letting someone else lead a task, even a small one, and consciously resist the urge to jump in and take back control.
That's all in one.
It is. Another one is to practice resting before you crash, not just in reaction to exhaustion. And maybe the most fundamental shift of all. Stop defaulting to the action-oriented question, the pillars question, what needs to be done, and start asking the relational, self-compassionate question, what do I need?
The strength that wears you out is strength without a relay. It's just an unsustainable system of resource extraction, and it's perpetually fueled by that fear of being seen as insufficient.
And the strength that sustains you is shared strength. It's our original blueprint for human thriving. The change that's required isn't about losing your inner solidity or your capacity. It's about fundamentally changing the distribution of effort. Those who are strong for too long don't become diminished when they finally let go of that role. They become uncluttered. They stop confusing their intrinsic value with their immediate utility.
So letting go of the title, the strong one, isn't an act of surrender. It's an act of sanity. It's choosing to build a structure that actually allows you to stand, rather than one that requires you to perpetually hold up the ceiling for everyone else.